For the entire nation, the Mississippi Delta sparkles like a guitar. In 1953, two lads met at a Queen's School talent performance. By 1970, they were the largest musical group. Then a horrible thing was said. It has nothing to do with money or music. They sang flawlessly together on stage for 10 years, but they refused to communicate offstage. Without informing the other, one of them independently recorded 30 songs. Without being asked, the other individual removed the lyrics. One wrote that the other was a monster in 2015. It was 9 years before they spoke again. Childhood pals became sworn enemies in this way. On October 13, 1941, Paul Simon was born in Newark, New Jersey. His parents were Hungarian Jews. His mother, Belle, was a first-grade teacher. His father, Louis, led two separate lives. During the day, he was a college instructor. At night, he performed as Lee Sims, a bassist in dance bands. Their home was filled with music and books. Paul was raised in a household that was quite structured, ritualistic, and rhythmic. He and Belle went to shul. Louis took him to Yankee Stadium. Watching Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio was about more than just baseball. It was about courageous individuals. Many years later, Paul would write DiMaggio into Mrs. Robinson. Paul's family relocated to Kew Gardens Hills in Queens when he was 4 years old. According to Trump, Paul was the typical Jewish kid in New York. He loved music and baseball, two things that often helped immigrants feel like they belonged. When they relocated, everything was different. It was not only a brand new home. It was a new beginning. Among the late-night television programs Louis and his family watched were Arthur Godfrey and His Friends and The Jackie Gleason Show. Paul witnessed his father's rapid transition from educator to entertainer. It was sensed. He realized that sounds were only one aspect of music. It had to do with work, performance, and character. The Queens neighborhood was full of Jewish families. They were devoted to education and music. Paul absorbed all that was said. He became familiar with Lead Belly's gritty folk blues, Woody Guthrie, and jazz. All of it altered his perspective on the world. Shortly thereafter, he discovered a singing idol at school. In 1953, Paul was 11 years old. He seen a youngster his age, Art Garfunkel, perform solo on stage while he was a student at Public School 164. He was fantastic, a girl whispered. That was it. Paul loved to sing, but he was also obsessed with the idea of singing to attract girls. Later that year, while they were both in Alice in Wonderland for their 6th grade graduation, they crossed paths once more. Even though it was only a spectacle, the school play was where they first sang. It was as though their voices were destined to be together. Together, they formed the Peptones, a doo-wop band. They performed at school dances and block celebrations. Paul started to compose music. By the age of 13, he had penned their first original. They were more than simply pals by the time they were 15. They were record producers and musicians. Under the aliases Tom and Jerry, they published the song, Hey Schoolgirl, in 1957. Their fondness for the Everly Brothers served as its foundation. They jotted down the lyrics to Hey Doll Baby, while they were trying to recall them. To create a demo, they pooled $25. That was a lot for children in 1957, but it was effective. Promoter Sid Prosen heard them and signed them. Paul's name was modified by Jerry Landis. Tom Graff became Art's new name. It reached the 49th spot on the Billboard charts. Over 100,000 copies were sold. Even American Bandstand featured them. They were well known by the age of 15. On the inside, however, things were becoming worse. Back then, Paul was more than just a singer. At the age of 12 or 13, he composed their debut song, The Girl for Me. His father even jotted down the lyrics and chords. The Library of Congress now has that piece of paper. Art's voice was superior. Paul was driven to succeed and had the pen. Paul's attempt to act and create art simultaneously was always unfair, and it would only get worse. Between 1957 and 1964, Paul led a covert musical life. While still working with Art, he produced over 30 songs under fictitious identities such as True Taylor, Paul Kane, and Jerry Landis. Among others, he worked for Madison, Amy, Big, Hunt, King, and Tribute. It was more than a pastime. Paul was secretly working on his own venture away from Art. He wasn't merely recording his own music. He was producing films and writing for other people. By 1962, he was writing music for Amy Records for Richie Cordell, The Veals, and Dory Daniels. He released his debut solo single under the name True Taylor in 1958. Thus, a few months after Hey Schoolgirl became popular, he was already planning his own career. When Sid Prosen approached Paul and made solo agreements to him without Art's knowledge, the true damage was done. Paul kept it to himself. It broke Art when he learned. The falsehood, he later said, ended their friendship. It was something he never forgot. Paul was figuring out how to escape, and Art still believed in them. That hurt a lot since Tom and Jerry were struggling to replicate their first hit. Paul left immediately. He continued. It wasn't until it was too late that Art realized what was happening. When Paul performed well without Art, things deteriorated. The song, Motorcycle, was a minor hit in 1962 when Paul was a member of a new band called Tycho and the Triumphs. It reached the 99th spot on the Billboard charts. At the same time, he released The Lone Teen Ranger, which was directed by Jerry Landis. On the charts, it is number 97. Despite being little victories, they demonstrated Paul's ability to function effectively without Art. In the Tycho and the Triumphs project, Paul's cunning side was exposed, but Marty Cooper, another singer, was the true face. The smash song had Paul as the lead vocalist. As a solo performer, he was still being himself but manipulating strings behind the scenes. This confirmed Paul's presumption. He managed to do it on his own. That made his previous betrayal appear even more premeditated. He wasn't merely taking new paths. Without telling Art, he replaced him. In 1958, they split up. It wasn't really exciting at the time. Despite their lack of action, the harm was significant. They didn't see one another again until 1963, which was 5 years later. At that period, Paul released around 30 songs under several identities. Art attempted to create music as well. But without Paul's encouragement and support, he didn't make any progress. Because they missed one another, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel did not reconcile in 1963. They were in a negative state. By 1963, Paul was barely surviving. He made impromptu calls to record labels to pitch songs as part of his profession. One of his tunes was heard and approved by Tom Wilson, the director of Columbia Records. However, Wilson did not want Paul, and it was titled, He Was My Brother. He believed the song might appeal to a British group. Paul took a bold step. He persuaded Wilson to allow him and Art to do one studio tryout. Wilson, who had collaborated with jazz greats like Miles Davis, was taken aback when they sang The Sound of Silence. Paul's comments and Art's clear voice pleased him. They received a legitimate job after just one test. For the first time, they went by their true names. But their situation was worse. The title of their debut album was Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., was completely unsuccessful. In just 8 months after its October 1964 release, just 1,000 copies were sold. The folk music they enjoyed suddenly became outdated. After the Beatles, there was no turning back. By claiming they were a part of an ancient custom, Columbia attempted to sell them at the worst possible moment. The review scores were dismal. Sales weren't as strong. They split up once more. Paul departed for England. He performed at small clubs. There, he even produced an album titled The Paul Simon Songbook on his own. Art remained in New York and returned to his studies at Columbia University. They were unaware that the songs Paul wrote while living alone in exile would go on to become popular melodies. Then an extremely odd event happened. Producer Tom Wilson secretly added drums and electric guitars to The Sound of Silence in 1965. Without first seeking permission, he did it shortly after Bob Dylan's work on Like a Rolling Stone. They were unaware. He simply let it go, and it worked. The revised version was played on Boston and Florida radio stations. The most peculiar thing Simon discovered was that, when performing in Denmark, he read Billboard magazine. The song peaked at number 1 on January 1, 1966. Paul was taken aback. Art called Paul to celebrate the party, but he was taken aback by the remake. He was angry with the beat alterations. Still, it was popular. They swiftly reunited to record a new album in order to capitalize on the trend. Now, however, something had changed. By 1966, Paul hoped to be in command. While they were recording Sage, Thyme, Rosemary, and Parsley, things became chaotic. He was responsible for the tools. The sound was his responsibility. He spent months working on it. During his time in England, he composed a great deal of music. Most of the time, Garfunkel came to sing. That was it. Many individuals purchased the record. It reached number 4 on the Billboard list and sold a lot of copies. Paul, however, started to believe that he was the genius who brought everything to pass. The voice was art. There, the situation would worsen. The Graduate followed. Their song was featured in the 1967 film, which was written by Mike Nichols. They became globally famous as a result. Despite the fact that the novel was not yet complete when it was released, the film Mrs. Robinson was a big smash. It reached the top of the charts. Their subsequent single, Bookends, contributed to their 16-week chart-topping run. They won Record of the Year at the Grammys. However, the progress had flaws. Paul believed that some people gave Art too much credit. The songs were believed to have been written by Art. The credit went to Art, even though Paul wrote it. Their boss stated it the best. They both wished each other well. Paul's sense of security was even worse. Paul will never forget Art's amusing remark, "I'll always be taller than you." The final blow then arrived, and that hurt for decades. Mike Nichols asked them to appear in Catch 22. Paul's part was cut, but they were both cast. The only person still in the film was Art. Paul was embarrassed. To make the film, Art traveled to Mexico. Paul did not leave New York. Everything became pretty evident after that split. Paul believed they would continue to create songs. For months, there was no Art. Instead of 6 weeks, it lasted a year. 2 lengthy sessions, one in November 1968 and another in January 1969, were required to produce their album Bridge Over Troubled Water. In between, Paul pondered and waited. Woodstock came and went. They couldn't do anything. Art continued to produce films. Paul put up a lot of effort, yet nothing remained the same. They had always relied heavily on real-time feedback to generate ideas. In the same room, I heard 2 voices. Art requested that Paul transmit tapes to Mexico. Art would return with fresh concepts. No, that part isn't good. Paul believed he was a lower-level employee. They placed it down. This was not how it was supposed to be. It all stopped until Art said something. He said to Paul, "This is how it will be, I will return after 6 months of filming. We'll put the CD together, and you'll have composed the songs." Paul's response was brief. Her words, "That's not going to happen." He wasn't simply rejecting a plan. He opposed the notion of someone paying him for his work as a songwriter. Paul had always written the songs, conducted the sessions, and produced the music. But Art received cheers from the crowd. When Art performed Bridge Over Troubled Water live, everyone went crazy. The final days of work on Bridge Over Troubled Water were peaceful, and Paul would stand in the background and think, "That's my song, man." Paul had the producer and the band to himself. Mexico had Art. In order to facilitate Art's mobility, the title track's instrumentation were even recorded in California. However, Art sang alone and received acclaim when it was his turn. Their greatest and final hit was that record. Simon and Garfunkel split up in 1970. The general consensus was that Paul Simon would move on fast. After 6 weeks at the top of the charts, Bridge Over Troubled Water had recently become a global smash. But Paul was afraid. He was scared, so he took chances. In January 1972, his debut solo album, simply titled Paul Simon, was released. One of the songs, Mother and Child Reunion, was inspired by a dinner item that featured chicken and eggs. What actually made it intriguing was the sound. Paul had traveled to Kingston, Jamaica, to create reggae music with Jimmy Cliff's band. It was successful. The song reached the top 5 in both the US and the UK. Paul's ability to write songs that sounded like stories was demonstrated by Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard, another song that reached number 22. It peaked at number 1 in the UK and Japan and number 4 in the US. Paul's debut record was this one. In 1973, it was released. His confidence was growing rapidly. He experimented with different instruments and genres of music. Kodachrome, which cleverly used pictures to discuss memories, was the second number 1 single. Then the Cashbox rankings were topped by the release of Loves Me Like a Rock. Despite not becoming a huge hit, American Tune had an emotional impact on listeners. In just a few lines, it conveyed the nation's sadness following Vietnam while using Aback music. That record topped the charts, according to Cashbox. 2 years later, Paul released Still Crazy After All These Years in 1975. His most sinister piece to yet. The songs were depressing and full of uncertainty, but they were a smash, and he had recently broken up with Peggy Harper. The record immediately shot to the top of the Billboard charts after winning Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Paul won the prize for Best Male Pop Vocalist as well. The most well-known song was 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. In early 1976, it topped the charts for 3 weeks. The unexpected smash, My Little Town, a reunion with Art Garfunkel, was also included on that same record. It reached the 9th position. Paul's home life, meanwhile, was anything but stable. In 1983, he wed Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia's wife. Their relationship progressed swiftly. They fell in love immediately after meeting during the craze for Star Wars. However, it was a bad decision for him to get married while on his comeback tour with Garfunkel. In a 2024 documentary, Paul reflected on his marriage and acknowledged it was difficult. Carrie was in the news all the time. She was aware of what fame was. No, Paul didn't. Paul wasn't built to deal with the press, and she handled it like a game. Despite their brief 11-month marriage, it had an impact. They were both at the prime of their professions. Paul was in the news again. The film industry continued to adore Carrie. Paul's best man, Sarah Michaels, described the wedding as a storm. They were surrounded by fame. Paul later said that he was worn down by being in Carrie's life. Her drug usage, her mood swings, and her need for attention from others. Everything was too much. He claimed that he believed his life had become a publicity stunt. Paul incorporated that emotional turmoil into his compositions. Despite receiving positive reviews, his 1983 album Hearts and Bones did not perform well at the box office. Even if the songs were honest, intimate, and profound, the audiences didn't understand them, at least not at the moment. Now it's obvious that he was internally collapsing. Meanwhile, new problems were brought on by the fame and fortune. They were constantly in front of cameras, in 5-star hotels, and on private planes during their marriage. According to Sarah Michaels, it felt like she was trapped in a dream. But it was more of a nightmare for Paul. And in that world, Carrie excelled. No, Paul didn't. He felt as though he was acting in order to survive. After they broke up, Paul changed. Their lives have been considerably more tranquil after he wed Eddie Bickle in 1992. They are parents of 3 kids. He was not mentioned in any articles after that. Paul wasn't finished debating, though. In 1985, when apartheid was in effect, he traveled to South Africa. Any cultural exchange with the government was strongly condemned by the UN. But Paul went. He spent 9 days recording with Sedgefield bands. They were afraid of the police and had to work during curfews. Paul, however, compensated them $200 per hour, more than 3 times their New York wages. The daily wage was only $15. However, protesters remained enraged. According to Ghana's UN ambassador, Paul's presence alone amounted to support for apartheid. The outcry was swift. Following him, protests took place in Birmingham and London. Musicians were critical of him. Everywhere Paul went on tour with Graceland, there were picket lines as well. Then another scandal arose. It has to do with theft. Paul stole their tune, according to Los Lobos' Steve Berlin. Berlin informed them that Paul wanted them to jam at Graceland and arrived completely empty-handed. Indeed, they did. Without giving them credit, Paul later included the song on his record. Paul just said, "Sue me and see what happens," Berlin claimed, when they protested. Paul refuted that. However, they claimed to have received nothing. No credit. There is silence and no compensation. More credit disputes arose, primarily from African artists. While some backed Paul, others felt taken advantage of. The sad reality, as South African jazz great Jonas Gwangwa once put it, "So it takes another white man to discover my people." Even though Simon offered prizes and paid more than the market rate, many people still felt that he had too much control. Paul remained persistent. According to him, the music itself was the protest. He believed that cooperation was the message, hence he didn't write political songs. To make matters worse, he also claimed, "I didn't ask the ANC for permission." Both the ANC and the UN placed him on a blacklist. He was accused of violating foreign law and informed he was not allowed to travel to South Africa. His name was removed by the UN in 1987, but the harm was already done. Decades later, artists like Jerry Dammers and Billy Bragg continued to criticize Paul's return to London. It all began with a fortuitous encounter in 1975. Art Garfunkel had not spoken to Paul Simon since their acrimonious split in 1970. But they were back in the same room, recording in Los Angeles with Harry Nilsson and John Lennon. Everything made sense. The tension seemed to subside. For a while, it was like old times. They decided to be a partner once more to give it another go. That year, they worked on it for months. They appeared to be searching for the enchantment that had brought them fame. But it didn't work. They put in a lot of work, but all they had to offer was one song, My Little Town. Ironically, the song appeared on both of their solo albums rather than a combined one. Despite their inability to agree on how to share their single song, they appeared to wish to reconcile. It was an indication of things to come. There was a high moment after that. On September 19, 1981, they stood together in Central Park. Over 500,000 individuals were present. The large field was packed with people. People climbed trees and sat on roofs to gain a better view. The show was historic in addition to being large. It cost HBO over $1 million to air. 2 million copies of the live recording were sold. To assist repair the park that was in disrepair, they raised $51,000. Once more, old songs reached the top of the charts. It appeared that everyone wanted them back. Behind the scenes, however, things were starting to fall apart. A 1982 world tour resulted from the song. Their spectacular comeback should have been that. Rather, it demonstrated how poorly they got along. They were unable to communicate. Not only disagreements, but also quiet. Every night, they would sing in exquisite harmony before leaving the stage to go their separate ways. They weren't even making an effort to get along. They attempted to correct it before to the trip. Dreams, promises, and words of truth. But when they reached the road, the fissures grew worse. Even riding together was impossible for them. Although the concert was seen by fans, things were gradually unraveling behind the scenes. In 1983, things deteriorated much further. They were working on an album called Think Too Much. Their first album since Bridge Over Troubled Water was this one. The voice for several songs was recorded by Garfunkel. The original plan was for it to be a complete Simon and Garfunkel album, but Paul decided against it. He kept his feelings about the songs, particularly the one about his love with Carrie Fisher, to himself from Garfunkel. He re-recorded everything, removed Art's singing, and released it under the title Hearts and Bones. Garfunkel was bruised. He was there the entire time and put in a lot of effort, but he got cut off. It was simply eliminated without any discussion or warning. Ultimately, he claimed it was a lie. They stopped writing songs together after that. 2010 was the final opportunity. For the return, a tour was organized. It was supposed to begin in New Orleans, but Garfunkel's vocal cords abruptly stopped moving. He could not sing. After being postponed, the show was cancelled. It didn't sit well with Simon. He believed that Garfunkel was lying about how terrible things were. Finally, the already shaky trust was broken. Garfunkel was apologized to by fans, but the harm was already done. Even after he recovered, Simon didn't want to continue. Garfunkel's 2015 action was to lash out. Garfunkel had a really difficult interview with The Telegraph in May of that year. For leaving after Bridge Over Troubled Water, he called Simon a fool and a jerk. He claimed that his sympathy for Simon's diminutive stature led to their friendship in 1953. Then came the strongest line. A monster was created by that act of compensation. Not only was it hurtful, but it was also touching. Simon was asked if he felt like Napoleon by the interviewer. Garfunkel made a snap decision. He also claimed that George Harrison had told him, "My Paul is to me what your Paul is to you. The Pauls put us in the background, and that was awful to hear from a close friend," would say so. Yes. It was not merely an assault. Comparing it to a famous feud just made matters worse. Simon didn't say anything at first, but when he didn't mince words. In a 2016 interview, he clarified that it was not enjoyable and that he and woman did not get along. He was no longer there. He sounded like he was at the end of his rope in 2018. There was no more hurry when he told her, "I'm done. I haven't written a new song in a few years." Now, they lacked the creative spark they formerly shared. It was over a decade before they spoke to one another again. From 2015 to 2024, there was absolutely no sound. Not a single phone call or text. Now in their 70s and 80s, two longtime friends are moving away from one another. The silence was only broken when Garfunkel happened to run across Simon's son Harper at their apartment complex. It resulted in a lunch gathering. When Garfunkel said, "What happened? Why haven't we seen each other?" Simon answered quietly, "An old interview. You said some stuff." Simon had his own issues during those silent years. He referred to his 33-minute acoustic album from 2023, 7 songs, as his most intimate creation. But behind it, something more significant was happening. He could hardly hear anything in his left ear. 6% remained. The doctors were unable to determine the cause. It happened in 2022 when he contracted a severe case of COVID-19, which also left him debilitated. "It crushed my heart to say, I can't do that one. That's gone." A man whose entire life revolved on music is suddenly losing the capacity to play it. He claimed he was no longer able to sing, "You Can Call Me Al." In November 2024, Simon expressed his frustration, anger, and silence toward the sole person who knew about his ascent to prominence as well as toward himself on CBS Mornings. A hush that caused them to reflect on missed opportunities, friendships that once had the power to transform the world, and bridges that had been destroyed. They started off as two Queens boys who yearned for greater things by singing into school microphones. They had succeeded. The music eventually ceased, their romance ended, and the quiet became louder than any harmony they had ever sung.